You ever walk into a place and feel the weight of history pressed down on you? Not the kind you read in books, but the kind that whispers from the shadows, that chills you to the bone? This isn't just an old building. It's a tomb where silence was a weapon, and sanity was the first casualty. And some things, once broken, never truly leave. The air inside Eastern State Penitentiary was a paradox, thick with the dust of forgotten decades, yet thin with the absence of life. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a woman whose sharp intellect was often veiled by a dismissive cynicism, inhaled deeply, finding only the scent of decay and damp stone. She wasn't here for ghosts or the morbid fascination that drew tourists to this crumbling monument to penal reform. Evelyn was a historian, a scholar of archaic systems and Eastern State, with its revolutionary separate system of solitary confinement, was a gold mine of human experiment and architectural ambition. Her commission was clear: document the forgotten narratives, the bureaucratic minutiae, the very essence of its operation, before the new preservation project sanitized its grim history. She saw the building not as a haunted relic, but as a colossal failed social experiment. "Welcome to the quietest place on earth, Doctor," a gruff voice echoed through the cavernous entrance hall. Jebediah, the groundskeeper, emerged from the shadows, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, eyes that seemed to hold generations of secrets. He was a man rooted to this place, his family having served as both guards and, he'd once cryptically hinted, inmates within these very walls. Evelyn offered a curt nod, already dismissing his soft-spoken warnings about the lingering residents. She'd heard it all before. Her chosen research station was Cellblock 1, the very heart of the separate system's brutal idealism. This block, designed for absolute isolation, was where the silence was meant to break the spirit, to force reflection and repentance. For Evelyn, it was the perfect laboratory. She meticulously set up her portable light, her digital recorder, and her stacks of brittle, yellowed documents in a cell near the end of a long, narrow corridor. The silence here was profound, almost physical, pressing in on her. As the afternoon light faded, casting long, skeletal shadows through the high, arched windows, Evelyn hunched over a ledger, deciphering the spidery script of a long-dead warden. A sudden, inexplicable chill swept through the cell, raising goosebumps on her arms. She shivered, attributing it to the ancient stone and the dropping temperature. Then, the fluorescent tube she'd rigged flickered violently, plunging the cell into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. "Old wiring," she muttered, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. It was then it happened. A sound, raw and primal, tore through the silence. A distinct, guttural scream, not human, yet undeniably born of agony, echoed from deep within the empty cell block. It resonated off the stone, filling the air with a chilling vibration, then cut off abruptly, leaving an unnerving, absolute silence in its wake. Evelyn froze, her pen suspended over the page. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She strained her ears, listening, but there was nothing. Just the silence. She shook her head, dismissing it as a trick of the acoustics, a phantom echo of the prison's violent past, or perhaps her own mind playing tricks. Yet the sound lingered, a cold knot in her stomach. Hours later, as dusk bled into night, Evelyn packed up her equipment. The screen still pricked at the edges of her awareness, a faint, unsettling hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. She gathered her notes, her recorder, her laptop. As she reached for her satchel, her hand brushed against something smooth and cold on a rough wooden surface of her makeshift desk. She looked down. There, placed neatly on the desk, was a single perfectly preserved antique child's toy. A wooden doll, its painted eyes wide and unblinking, its tiny dress faded but intact. It hadn't been there minutes ago. The prison had been empty for decades, stripped of its personal effects. A prickle of unease crawled up her spine. She picked it up, feeling the smooth, cool wood. It was old, impossibly old, yet pristine. She turned it over in her hand, searching for a logical explanation. A forgotten prop from a previous tour? A prank by Jebediah, trying to reinforce the haunted narrative? She dismissed both possibilities as quickly as they arose. The doll felt deliberate. She placed it back down, a shiver running through her. The silence of Cellblock 1 suddenly felt less like an absence and more like a watchful presence. She left the doll where it lay, hurrying out. The image of its wide, unblinking eyes burned into her mind. The dawn offered no solace. Evelyn returned to Eastern State Penitentiary the next morning. The memory of the scream and the wooden doll a persistent, irritating burr in her mind. She told herself it was fatigue, the isolated environment playing tricks, a residual effect of the prison's grim history. But as she stepped back into Cellblock 1, her gaze immediately went to her desk. The doll was still there, precisely where she'd left it, its painted eyes seeming to mock her rationalizations. It was a silent, unblinking challenge to her scientific mind. She picked it up, examined it again, then placed it face down, a futile attempt to dismiss its unsettling presence. She buried herself in the archives, a mountain of brittle documents that promised to ground her in tangible facts. Days blurred into a relentless cycle of deciphering faded ink and crumbling paper. She found inmate records detailing forced silence, sensory deprivation, and the chillingly clinical observations of wardens noting the melancholy and insanity that blossomed under the separate system. Accounts spoke of men driven to self-mutilation, of inmates found dead in their cells with no apparent cause, their faces frozen in silent screams. These were not ghost stories, but medical reports, meticulously documented descent into madness. A name began to surface with unnerving regularity. Elias Thorne, inmate 734. His file was thicker than most, filled with escalating reports of defiance, then despair, then a chilling silence that preceded his unexplained death in Cellblock 1, just a few cells down from Evelyn's current research station. The details were sparse, deliberately vague, but the underlying narrative was clear. Thorne had been broken by the system, his spirit crushed by the very solitude meant to reform him. Evelyn worked late into the evening, the only sound the rustle of paper and the soft click of her keyboard. She was engrossed in Thorne's final medical report, a stark, clinical description of his rapid decline. The chill she'd felt before returned, more intense this time, a cold breath on her neck despite the still air. Then a faint scratching began. It was subtle at first, like mice in the walls, but it quickly intensified, becoming a frantic, rhythmic scraping, as if something with sharp claws was desperately trying to tear its way out from behind the stone. It wasn't coming from a distant part of the block. It was coming from the wall directly beside her, the very wall of her research cell. Evelyn dropped her pen, her heart leaping into her throat. She pressed her ear to the cold stone, hearing the frantic, tearing sound, so close, so visceral. It sounded like pure desperation, like someone trapped and clawing for freedom. "Hello?" she called out, her voice a shaky whisper. The scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than before, as if the very air had absorbed the sound and was holding its breath. She banged on the wall with her fist, a desperate attempt to elicit a response, but there was only the mocking, absolute quiet. She pulled her hand back, her knuckles aching, her mind racing for a logical explanation. Settling stone? Rodents? But the sound had been too deliberate, too desperate. That night, sleep offered no escape. Evelyn S. dreams were a terrifying kaleidoscope of the historical accounts. She'd read, gaunt faces pressed against cell doors, disembodied whispers echoing in endless corridors, the metallic tang of blood in the air. She saw Elias Thorne's face, contorted in silent agony, his eyes hollowed by despair, and she felt the crushing weight of isolation, as if it were her own. She woke in a cold sweat, the line between her research and her nightmares blurring into a terrifying reality. The next morning, Evelyn felt a profound weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. She walked into Cellblock 1, her eyes immediately drawn to the wall beside her desk, the one where she'd heard the scratching. She ran her fingers over the rough stone, half expecting to find claw marks. There were none. But then, her gaze dropped. Etched into the stone, just above the dusty floorboards, were a series of small, meticulously carved tally marks. 3 distinct sets, each consisting of 7 vertical lines, precisely grouped. They were fresh, the stone beneath them lighter than the surrounding grime, as if carved very recently. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She had seen this pattern before. Just yesterday, in Elias Thorne's diary, a chilling entry describing his method of counting the days of his solitary confinement, 7 marks for 7 days. A week of silence, another week, another. The marks on her wall were identical. She stared at them, her mind reeling. This wasn't old wiring, or acoustics, or a prank. This was new. This was personal. The doll, the scream, the scratching, they were all connected, leading to this undeniable, terrifying invasion of her reality. Evelyn backed away slowly from the wall, her eyes fixed on the fresh carvings. The silence of the penitentiary no longer felt like an absence. It felt like a presence. A watchful, malevolent presence that was not only aware of her, but was actively trying to communicate, to recreate its torment, to draw her deeper into its suffocating embrace. And it was learning her. The tally marks on the wall of Evelyn's research cell were a stark, undeniable truth etched into the stone, mocking her every attempt at rationalization. She spent the better part of the morning of her 3rd day at Eastern State, tracing them with a trembling finger. The cool, rough surface, a stark contrast to the burning confusion in her mind. They were too precise, too fresh, too eerily identical to Elias Thorne's desperate count. The wooden doll, still face down on her desk, felt like a silent, accusing witness. Her scientific mind, usually her fortress, was under siege, cracks forming in its foundation. She tried to regain control, to anchor herself in the tangible. She dove deeper into the prison's forgotten corners, seeking out records that might explain the anomalies, desperate for a logical thread to pull. It was in a dusty, forgotten storage room, tucked behind a stack of condemned furniture, that she found it. A small leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and brittle, alongside a bundle of faded letters tied with a frayed ribbon. The inscription inside identified the author as Reverend Thomas Albright, the prison's chaplain from the late 19th century. Albright's entries were not the dry, clinical observations of the wardens. They were the anguished confessions of a man witnessing the slow, agonizing destruction of human souls. He wrote of inmates who spoke to unseen figures, who clawed at their own flesh, who whispered secrets to the walls. But more chillingly, Albright also documented his own growing unease. He described a pervasive coldness that settled in the cell blocks, a whispering presence that seemed to feed on despair, and an inexplicable feeling of being watched, even when alone. He hinted at something beyond human cruelty at work within the prison, a malevolence that seeped into the very stone, affecting not just the prisoners, but the staff too. His final entries grew erratic, filled with frantic prayers and pleas for deliverance from an unseen observer that was slowly consuming his own faith and sanity. Evelyn Reed, her blood running cold. Albright's experiences mirrored her own, validating her terror while simultaneously deepening it. This wasn't just a historical record. It was a personal connection to the very dread she was now experiencing. She clutched the journal, a desperate lifeline in a sea of unreality. Returning to her research cell, Evelyn felt a renewed urgency. She needed to cross-reference Albright's notes with Thorne's file to find the intersection, the true nature of the entity. She flipped on her portable light, illuminating her whiteboard, where she'd scrawled notes and timelines. Her breath hitched. Crudely sketched, but undeniably present, was a drawing on the whiteboard. A stick figure, hunched and emaciated, sitting in a solitary cell. Its eyes, two dark, hollow circles, seemed to follow her, a chilling emptiness in their gaze. It wasn't there when she left. She knew it. Her hand trembled as she reached out, almost touching the chalk lines. This wasn't a trick of light or sound. This was a direct, undeniable interaction. Someone or something had been in her cell. A sudden, sharp click echoed from the corridor. Evelyn spun around. The heavy, iron-barred door of her cell block, which she had propped open with a wedge, was now shut, the ancient lock mechanism audibly engaging with a final metallic thud. She rushed to it, rattling the bars, but it was firmly secured. Her phone, which had a weak signal earlier, now showed no service. The building was actively isolating her. The very air seemed to thicken, pressing in, making each breath a conscious effort. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at her composure. She wasn't just observing history. She was becoming part of it. Desperate for a moment of clarity, Evelyn wandered deeper into the abandoned sections of the prison, seeking a different perspective, a way out of the suffocating feeling. She found herself in what must have been a guard's washroom, a grimy tiled space with a single cracked mirror above a rusted sink. She splashed cold water on her face, trying to shake off the growing hysteria. She looked into the mirror, her reflection pale and drawn, eyes wide with fear. As she stared, her own image began to distort. Her eyes widened impossibly, her mouth stretched into a silent scream. And then, slowly, a gaunt, skeletal face, its skin stretched taut over bone, began to superimpose itself over her own. Its hollow eyes stared back, and a faint, raspy whisper seemed to even emanate not from the mirror, but from inside her head. Alone? Forever? The superimposed face vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only Evelyn's terrified reflection staring back. She stumbled backward, hitting the cold tiles of the wall, gasping for air. Her mind reeled, struggling to reconcile what she'd seen. Hallucination? Exhaustion? Or was the prison truly alive, preying on her deepest fears, turning her own reflection into a tool of torment? She pressed a hand to her pounding temple, trying to steady herself. As she pushed herself off the wall, her foot nudged something small and metallic on the dusty floor. She looked down. It was a tarnished silver locket, old and worn, almost invisible against the grime. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. It was surprisingly heavy. With a click, it sprang open. Inside, faded and almost indistinguishable, was a tiny sepia-toned photograph. It was a picture of Jebediah, the groundskeeper, but as a young boy, perhaps no older than 10 or 12. He stood outside the penitentiary gates, his small hand clutching a wooden doll identical to the one on her desk. But it wasn't the doll that sent a fresh wave of dread through Evelyn. It was the look on young Jebediah's face, a profound sorrow, a deep-seated fear that Evelyn had never seen in the old man's eyes. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, too young, and was already broken by the shadows of Eastern State. The locket slipped from her numb fingers, clattering softly onto the cold, unforgiving floor. The tarnished silver locket lay on the grimy floor. A tiny, ominous portal to a past Evelyn was only just beginning to comprehend. The image of young Jebediah, clutching the identical wooden doll, his eyes wide with a fear that echoed through generations, shattered any remaining illusion of rational control. This wasn't just a haunted building. It was a living, breathing entity. And Jebediah, the stoic groundskeeper, was entangled in its history, perhaps even its current torment. The realization sent a fresh wave of terror through Evelyn, colder than any draft. She snatched up the locket, stuffing it into her pocket, the metallic chill a constant reminder. Her mind raced, connecting the dots. The doll, the tally marks, Albright's desperate entries, and now Jebediah's childhood fear. There was a narrative here, a horrifying truth buried beneath the prison's decaying grandeur. She returned to her research cell, no longer seeking refuge in logic, but desperate for answers that might save her sanity or her life. Evelyn plunged back into Elias Thorne's file, now with a new, terrifying lens. She cross-referenced dates with Albright's journal, piecing together fragments until the full, horrific picture emerged. Thorne, inmate 734, had not simply died of an unexplained illness. Albright's final, frantic entries, hidden beneath layers of religious scripture, spoke of Thorne's escalating screams from Cellblock 1, screams that were deliberately ignored by a particularly cruel guard named Silas Croft, a man known for his sadistic pleasure in the breaking of inmates. Albright hinted that Croft had, in his zeal for the separate system, taken it to a monstrous extreme, denying Thorne food and water, leaving him to succumb to a slow, agonizing death by dehydration and madness, all while the other guards turned a blind eye. Thorne's final moments, as described by Albright, were a crescendo of scratching at the walls, guttural cries, and a childlike weeping that eventually faded into an unnatural silence. The tally marks, the scratching Evelyn had heard, the child's toy, it was all Thorne. His suffering was etched into the very fabric of this place. As Evelyn absorbed this chilling revelation, the air in her cell grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The whispers returned, no longer faint, but distinct, guttural murmurs that seemed to emanate from the very stone around her. "Thirsty, so thirsty?" A raspy voice hissed directly into her ear, sending a jolt of ice through her veins. A cold, skeletal hand seemed to brush against her cheek, leaving a clammy, lingering chill. She recoiled, scrambling backward, knocking over her chair. Then, the heavy iron cell door, which she had meticulously propped open with a wedge, slammed shut behind her with a deafening clang that echoed through the empty block. The ancient lock mechanism audibly engaged, a final metallic thud sealing her in. She was trapped. The darkness that followed was absolute, deeper than any natural night, as if the very light had been sucked from the air. From the pitch-black corridor, inches from her ear, she heard it. The distinct, ragged breathing of someone nearby, a desperate, rasping sound. It was followed by a child's mournful cry, a heart-wrenching sob that quickly, terrifyingly, morphed into a guttural, inhuman growl, a sound of pure, unadulterated malice. Evelyn pressed herself against the cold wall, her breath catching in her throat, paralyzed by a fear that transcended logic. The ghost wasn't just haunting the building. It was actively trying to recreate its own torment within her, isolating her, driving her to the same despair. She fumbled for her phone, but the screen remained stubbornly black. No service, a cruel taunt. Panic clawed at her. She had to get out. She stumbled through the oppressive darkness, hands outstretched, desperate to find an exit. She tried the cell door again, rattling the bars, but it was unyielding. The growling continued, circling her, always just out of reach, always just a breath away. In her frantic search, she stumbled, her hands scraping against a rough, damp stone wall. As she pushed herself up, her fingers found a hidden seam, a slight give in the ancient masonry. Curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need for a distraction from the terror, momentarily overrode her fear. She pushed harder, and a section of the wall swung inward with a faint groan, revealing a narrow, lightless passage. It wasn't on any prison blueprint she had studied. Driven by a morbid compulsion, Evelyn fumbled for her flashlight, its beam cutting a shaky path through the oppressive gloom. The passage led to a small, forgotten room, not much larger than a cell, but unlike any other. It felt like a shrine. In the center, illuminated by her trembling light, was a meticulously preserved, horrifying diorama of the prison. It was crudely made, yet disturbingly detailed, tiny, hand-carved figures depicting the exact scene of Elias Thorne's death, as described by Albright. A miniature, emaciated figure lay on the floor of a cell, while another, larger figure, presumably Croft, stood outside, a cruel, painted smile on its face. Miniature, blood-like stains were meticulously painted around the tiny inmate. It was a grotesque, perfect recreation of Thorne's final agony, a tableau of torment. The air in the room was thick, heavy, as if the suffering depicted had never truly left. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a performance, a reenactment, and Evelyn was now the unwilling audience, trapped in the ghost's eternal play. The diorama in the hidden room was not merely a model. It was a window into Elias Thorne's final, agonizing moments, a tableau vivante of his torment. Evelyn stared at the miniature figures, the crude bloodstains, the painted, cruel smile and cross face, and a cold dread settled deep within her bones. This wasn't just a haunting. It was an active reenactment, a performance designed to break her, just as Thorne had been broken. The air in the tiny room grew thick, suffocating, heavy with the phantom screams of a man dying of thirst. The growling from the corridor outside intensified, no longer circling, but pressing against the hidden wall, a hungry, predatory sound. She stumbled backward, out of the hidden room, scrambling to push the secret panels shut, desperate to seal away the horror. But the diorama, the images of Thorne's suffering, had imprinted themselves on her mind. They were no longer just historical facts. They were her reality. The prison became a living nightmare. Evelyn's perception fractured, the lines between past and present blurring into a terrifying, indistinguishable haze. She saw gaunt, spectral faces in the shadows of every cell, their eyes hollow, their mouths agape in silent screams. She heard their pleas, their desperate whispers, not just echoing through the stone, but resonating inside her own head, as if their thoughts had become her own. Water, please. Water. A chorus of raspy voices chanted, a tormenting thirst that began to manifest in her own throat, dry and aching. She found herself performing actions she didn't remember initiating. One morning, she woke to find her hands covered in chalk dust. A series of frantic, overlapping tally marks scrawled across the walls of her research cell, mirroring Thorne's desperate count, but far more chaotic, spiraling into madness. Another time, she caught herself scratching at her own forearm, nails dragging against skin, a subconscious echo of the desperate clawing she'd heard from within the walls. The scientific detachment she had prided herself on crumbled, leaving her exposed, raw, and terrified. Her skepticism was not merely broken. It was annihilated, replaced by a primal, overwhelming fear. "Dr. Reed, are you in there?" Jebediah's voice, gruff but laced with genuine concern, sliced through the oppressive silence. He was at the Cellblock door, rattling the bars. "I saw your lights out all night. You shouldn't be here after dark, not alone." Evelyn stumbled towards him, her vision swimming, the faces of dead inmates momentarily superimposed over Jebediah's own. "Jebediah, it's real," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Thorne, Croft, it's all happening again." Jebediah's eyes, usually so stoic, held a flicker of profound sorrow. "I know, Doctor. My grandfather, he worked here. He saw things. Said some souls never leave. They just wait for someone to listen." He fumbled with a large, rusted key ring. "Come on, I'll get you out of here. You need to leave this place." As Jebediah worked on the ancient lock, the air around them grew impossibly cold. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of anguished voices swirling around Evelyn, pressing in on her. "Don't let her leave," they hissed, a collective malevolence. Jebediah grunted, struggling with the stubborn lock. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic shriek echoed through the block, followed by the sound of heavy chains rattling violently from above. Jebediah looked up, his face paling. What in God's name? A massive, rusted iron gate, suspended high above the central corridor, began to creak downwards, slowly, inexorably, blocking the main exit route. It was a gate that hadn't moved in decades, its chains thick with rust. No, Jebediah cried, frantically twisting the key. It's trying to keep us in. Just as the gate was about to seal them off, a massive, unseen force slammed into Jebediah from behind. He cried out, a choked gasp, and was thrown violently against the stone wall. The key ring clattered to the floor. Evelyn screamed, rushing to his side. He lay slumped against the wall, his eyes wide and unseeing, a thin trickle of blood escaping the corner of his mouth. His neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, his body still lifeless. Evelyn recoiled, her mind screaming. Jebediah was dead, murdered, and she was the only witness. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the cacophony, a heavy, accusing blanket. She was alone, truly alone, trapped with the very entity that had just claimed a life. The murder mirrored the unexplained deaths in the prison's past, casting her as the prime suspect, further isolating her. She stumbled away from Jebediah's body, her breath ragged, tears streaming down her face. Her gaze fell on the groundskeeper's belt, where a small, worn leather-bound journal was tucked into a pouch. With trembling hands, she pulled it out. It wasn't about the prison's history. It was Jebediah's personal journal. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the familiar, looping script. The entries were dated, stretching back years. They detailed his own slow, agonizing descent into madness, filled with crude, frantic drawings identical to the one that had appeared on her whiteboard. The emaciated figure in the cell, its hollow eyes staring out. He described the same cold spots, the whispers, the scratching from within the walls, the vivid nightmares. His final entries were desperate pleas for release, for the unseen observer to leave him alone, to stop showing him the faces. He had been targeted, tormented, just like Thorne, just like the chaplain, and now, just like her. The realization was a fresh wave of horror. Jebediah hadn't been trying to help her escape the prison. He had been trying to pass on the burden, to find someone else to share the torment, to finally be free himself. He was a victim, just like all the others, caught in the prison's endless cycle of suffering. And now, Evelyn was next. Jebediah's journal lay open in Evelyn's trembling hands, a chilling testament to a shared torment. His looping script, once a comforting sign of his presence, now felt like a desperate, posthumous plea. The crude drawings, identical to the one on her whiteboard, the descriptions of cold spots, whispers, and the insidious scratching within the walls, it was all there, a horrifying mirror of her own descent. The final entries, frantic and barely legible, spoke of the faces and a desperate yearning for release from the unseen observer. He hadn't been trying to save her. He had been trying to pass on the burden, to find someone else to bear the weight of the prison's collective agony. The realization was a fresh wave of horror, solidifying the terrifying truth. Evelyn was not just haunted, she was the next victim in a generational cycle of torment. She stumbled away from Jebediah's body, the stench of fear and death clinging to the air. The iron gate remained stubbornly down, sealing her in. Her phone was useless. She was utterly alone, trapped with the very force that had just claimed a life and was now actively preying on her sanity. Despite the terror, a desperate clarity began to emerge through the fog of her fractured mind. Jebediah's journal, combined with Albright's confessions and Thorne's agonizing history, painted a picture far more complex than a single vengeful spirit. The unseen observer wasn't just Elias Thorne. It was something larger, something that fed on the very despair the separate system was designed to cultivate. Evelyn retreated to her research cell, no longer seeking answers, but a weapon. She spread out the documents, her hands shaking as she arranged them. Albright's entries, detailing the widespread psychological breakdowns, the collective despair, the coldness that permeated the entire prison. Thorne's file, a singular, horrific example of that despair. And now, Jebediah's journal, proving the torment extended beyond the inmates, affecting anyone who spent too long within these walls, anyone who listened. The whispers around her intensified, a cacophony of overlapping voices, not distinct words, but a rising tide of anguish, a chorus of suffering. Empty, hollow, forgotten. They moaned, a symphony of lost souls. It wasn't one ghost, it was all of them. The twist, the horrifying truth, slammed into Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. The ghost of Eastern State Penitentiary was not singular. It was a collective entity, a psychic imprint of every soul broken by the separate system. Every scream, every tear, every descent into madness had imbued the very stone with a malevolent consciousness. Elias Thorne was merely the most potent manifestation, the focal point of their combined agony, the key to their torment. The prison itself was alive, a monstrous organism feeding on the sanity of those who dared to enter, seeking to perpetuate its suffering through new victims. This wasn't about banishing a ghost. It was about confronting a living, breathing monument to human despair. Evelyn realized that physical escape wasn't enough. She needed to break the psychological cycle the collective entity was imposing. She needed to understand its true nature, not just its history. Her gaze fell upon the tarnished silver locket she'd found in Chapter 3, still clutched in her hand. It felt heavier now, almost pulsing with a faint, cold energy. She remembered the profound sorrow in young Jebediah's eyes in the photograph. There had to be more. Instinctively, she ran her thumb along its worn edges, feeling for a seam, a hidden catch. Her fingers snagged on a tiny, almost imperceptible indentation along the inner rim. She pressed. With a faint click, the locket sprang open further, revealing a minuscule, hidden compartment, barely large enough for a sliver of paper. Inside, nestled against the faded velvet lining, was a tiny, intricate antique key made of dark, aged iron. It was no larger than her thumbnail, yet it radiated an unsettling significance. Beneath the key, a final folded piece of paper, impossibly thin, was tucked into the compartment. It was a fragment torn from Jebediah's journal, his last desperate message, written in a hand even more frantic than his final entries. It read, "The collective, it feeds, it binds. Only the truth can sever, the key to the heart of its suffering. Find the source, the first, the deepest wound. Release or be consumed. My ancestor, he tried, failed. Don't let it take you. Like it took." The message abruptly cut off. The ink smudged as if his hand had been violently pulled away. The first, the deepest wound. Evelyn's mind raced. The diorama, the hidden room. That was where Thorne's final agony was preserved. That was where the collective entity had truly begun to coalesce. The key, then, must be for something within that horrifying shrine, something that held the true, darkest secret of the collective entity, or a way to sever its connection to the physical world. But Jebediah's warning echoed in her mind. Release or be consumed. The price, she knew, would be terrible. She was no longer just a historian. She was a participant, a target, and the only one left to face the ghost of Eastern State Penitentiary. The tiny iron key, warm against Evelyn's clammy palm, felt like a burning coal. Jebediah's final, fragmented message echoed in her mind. The collective, it feeds, it binds. Only the truth can sever, the key to the heart of its suffering. Find the source, the first, the deepest wound. Release or be consumed. The words were a desperate, posthumous guide. The first, the deepest wound. It could only refer to Elias Thorne, inmate 734, and the horrifying diorama in the hidden room, the chilling tableau of his final agony. That was where the collective entity had truly begun to coalesce, the epicenter of the prison's malevolence. Leaving Jebediah's still form where he lay, Evelyn stumbled through the oppressive darkness of Cellblock 1. The collective entity was no longer just whispering. It was roaring in her mind, a cacophony of anguished voices, a symphony of torment. Phantom hands brushed against her, cold and skeletal, pulling at her clothes, urging her towards madness. She could feel their despair, their rage, their endless thirst, a suffocating weight that threatened to crush her. But the key, the message, the faint hope of breaking the cycle, propelled her forward. She found the hidden passage, its entrance almost invisible in the gloom. Pushing the panel open, she stepped back into the small, forgotten room, the diorama bathed in the weak beam of her flashlight. It was even more grotesque now, the crude figures seeming to writhe in the flickering light, the painted bloodstains almost glistening. This was the heart of its suffering. Evelyn knelt before the diorama, her fingers tracing the tiny, intricate details. The key. Where? She examined the miniature cell, the tiny figure of Thorne, the cruel guard. Her gaze settled on the miniature cell door, a tiny, almost invisible keyhole etched into its surface. It was impossibly small, yet perfectly crafted. With trembling hands, she inserted the antique key. It slid in with a soft snick, a sound that resonated with an unnerving finality. As she turned the key, a low, guttural groan emanated from the diorama itself, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the stone. The miniature cell door swung open, revealing not a tiny, empty space, but a sliver of darkness, a void that seemed to swallow the light. From this void, a single ancient leather-bound book, no bigger than her thumb, slowly slid out onto the diorama's floor. Evelyn picked it up. It was a miniature version of Albright's journal, but its cover was scorched, its pages brittle and blackened. She opened it to a random page, her flashlight beam illuminating a single horrifying entry, written in a hand that was both Albright's and Thorne's, and perhaps even Jebediah's, a fusion of their despair. They watch. They wait. They hunger. The silence, it breeds them. And now I am one of them. This wasn't just a record of suffering. It was a conduit. This book, this miniature journal, was the physical manifestation of the collective entity's deepest wound, the first instance where the system truly broke a soul and began to feed. To release it, Evelyn realized she had to acknowledge it, to give voice to its silence. She stumbled out of the hidden room, clutching the miniature journal, and made her way to the central hub of the prison. This vast circular space, with cell blocks radiating out like spokes of a wheel, was the symbolic heart of the separate system, the place where all solitude converged. The air here vibrated with an almost unbearable psychic energy. The collective entity was no longer just in her head. It was all around her, a swirling vortex of spectral figures, their forms indistinct, their cries a deafening chorus of agony. They were the faces Jebediah had seen, the unseen observers. This was the confrontation, not with fists or weapons, but with her mind, her will, her very sanity. The entity bombarded her, a relentless barrage of images. Thorne's parched throat, Albright's crumbling faith, Jebediah's final desperate struggle. She felt the crushing weight of their isolation, the burning thirst, the gnawing hunger for release. They wanted her to join them, to become another voice in their endless chorus of suffering. Evelyn fought back, clinging to the fragments of her historical knowledge. She knew their pain. She knew their stories. She had to give them voice, to break the silence that had bound them. With a desperate, trembling hand, she opened the miniature journal to the final scorched page. Taking a deep breath, she began to read aloud, her voice cracking but resolute. Not the words of the journal, but the true story of Elias Thorne, of Silas Croft's cruelty, of Albright's despair, of Jebediah's generational burden. She spoke of the system that broke them, the silence that consumed them, acknowledging every single soul trapped within these walls. She was not banishing them. She was bearing witness. As Evelyn spoke, the cacophony of whispers began to subside, replaced by a profound, almost reverent silence. The spectral figures around her seemed to coalesce, their forms becoming clearer, their faces etched with a fleeting moment of peace. The oppressive weight in the air lessened, replaced by a chilling calm. When she finished, the silence stretched, heavy with unspoken understanding. Then, a single, clear, ancient voice, resonating not from the prison walls, but from deep within Evelyn's own mind, spoke. It was the voice of the collective, the voice of Eastern State itself, devoid of malice, yet utterly chilling in its knowing finality. Thank you. Now you belong to us. A wave of profound exhaustion washed over Evelyn, a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue, reaching into the very core of her being. The miniature journal slipped from her grasp, falling to the stone floor with a soft thud. The spectral figures, now distinct, faded into the stone walls, their faces still, their eyes fixed on her. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer oppressive, but watchful. Evelyn was still alive, still standing, but she felt profoundly changed. A part of her, she knew, had been left behind in that central hub. A piece of her soul now intertwined with the collective suffering of Eastern State Penitentiary. The horror hadn't ended. It had merely found a new keeper. The first light of dawn filtered through the high, barred windows of Eastern State Penitentiary, casting long, accusing shadows across the central hub. Evelyn lay sprawled on the cold stone floor, the miniature journal clutched in her hand, the single, ancient voice still echoing in the hollow chambers of her mind. Thank you. Now you belong to us. She didn't know how long she had been there. Hours? Days? Time had ceased to exist within those walls, replaced by the crushing weight of collective suffering. When the morning shift of security guards found her, she was barely conscious, her eyes wide and unfocused, her body trembling uncontrollably. They found Jebediah's body nearby, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, and the scene was quickly cordoned off. Evelyn was questioned, but her answers were fragmented, laced with references to collective souls and unseen observers. Her story, wild and unbelievable, was dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized woman. She was taken to a hospital, then released into the care of a distant, bewildered relative. The world outside the prison walls felt alien, too bright, too loud. Evelyn was no longer the cynical, rational historian. Her skepticism had been shattered, replaced by a haunting understanding of the unseen, an indelible imprint of the prison's agony. She saw spectral faces in the crowds, heard faint whispers in the wind, felt fleeting cold spots in otherwise warm rooms. The thirst, Elias Thorne's thirst, was a constant ache in her throat, a phantom sensation that no amount of water could quench. She was free, yet profoundly, irrevocably changed. A piece of her soul, she knew, had been left behind in that central hub, now intertwined with the collective suffering of Eastern State Penitentiary. The horror hadn't ended. It had merely found a new keeper. The preservation project at Eastern State Penitentiary was halted indefinitely. Officially, it was due to unforeseen structural complications and budgetary concerns. Unofficially, rumors spread like wildfire, fueled by the mysterious death of the groundskeeper and the incoherent ramblings of the last historian to work there. The prison was deemed too dangerous, its secrets sealed away from the public, its imposing walls now a permanent monument to an unspoken dread. Evelyn, unable to return to her academic life, found herself compelled to write. Not a dry historical text, but a memoir, a chilling account of her time within the prison walls. She titled it, The Unseen Observer, My Descent into Eastern State's Silent Torment. It was controversial, Of course, dismissed by many as the sensationalized fantasy of a woman who had suffered a psychological breakdown. But for others, it resonated deeply, tapping into a primal fear of the unknown. The book became a critical success, a disturbing bestseller. In the final pages of her book, Evelyn included a photograph of the tarnished silver locket she'd found and the tiny, antique key it contained. She hinted at the secrets they held, the lineage of torment, the generational burden. The very last line of the printed book, a postscript, was a single chilling sentence. And the tally marks continue. But for those who purchased the first edition, a horrifying secret lay hidden. Within the thick, aged paper of the book's final page, a small, almost invisible indentation could be felt. If one pressed hard enough, a tiny, perfectly carved keyhole would appear, identical to the one on the miniature diorama. And if one possessed the antique key and turned it, a new chilling message would be revealed, written, not in Evelyn's elegant script, but in a crude, frantic hand eerily similar to Elias, Thorne's, or Jebediah's, or even the chaplain's effusion of their despair, etched directly into the page. 7 marks for 7 days. Another week of silence. Another, we are here. We are always here. And now, so are you. Evelyn Reed was still alive, still breathing, but the question of her sanity and the true nature of the horror remained. Had she merely escaped the prison, or had she become its new vessel, carrying the collective torment with her, spreading its insidious influence through her work, ensuring that the ghost of Eastern State Penitentiary would never truly be confined to its walls again? The silence, she knew, was always listening, and perhaps now it was listening through her.